Are you a fan of the finest up-and-coming filmmakers that Scotland and the rest of the world has to offer? Then look no further than the Glasgow Film Festival. Glasgow short film. That Scotland and the rest of the world has to offer? Then look no further than the Glasgow Film Festival. Shit. It's tatty, is it not? Look no further than the Glasgow Glasgow Short Film Festival. I'll do that again, but the list for. You told me that this was a trailer for the Glasgow Film Festival. I shouldn't be doing this. Glasgow Film Festival, yes. The Edinburgh Film Festival, a push. But the Glasgow Short Film Festival, no. You listen to me. It's just diddy wee films. Things about your granny or your drunk dad. Guaranteed there'll be some foreign animation that nobody understands. That'll be winning a prize, don't you worry about that. Are you a fan of the finest up-and-coming filmmakers that Scotland and the rest of the world has to offer? Then look no further than the Glasgow Short Film Festival 2021. Give a lick of paint.
Welcome everyone to this live Q&A for Barbed Wire Love 2 Ancestral Homes. My name is Mary Carton. I'm the co-curator of this strand along with Peter Taylor. And we are delighted to be joined by 5 filmmakers tonight. So we have Simon Apley, who's the director of Eden and Ancestral Houses. We have Julia Fiona Brown, who is the director of Apartment Tour with Mary Florence Brown. Seamus Harahan, the director of Tessie's. Michael Barwise, the director of Legacy. And Alex Monteith, the director of Chapter and Verse.
Yeah, so relating to the North of Ireland's troubles, Barbed Wire Love presents intimate tales from those who stayed, those who left, and those who passed through. Chance encounters, intimate first-person cinema, and the unreliability of history and biography create space for wry humor and tiny ecstasies. And yeah, I guess ultimately we hope that the program really creates new possibilities for connection. Yeah, if you haven't yet seen the films, they're all available on demand at the festival's hub, online hub, for another 24 hours. And if you have any questions while you're watching now, you can tweet them to @GlasgowShort, or you can email questions at glasgowshort.org. And if you're watching this stream on Facebook, hi, just post your questions to the comments and we'll pick them up from there. Yeah, and I'd really like to thank Louise McDade, who's providing live captions for the session, and Polona Kuzman, who's running the live stream. Thanks so much.
Yeah, great. So the way this is going to work is we're going to ask if everyone introduces themselves briefly and says why they made their work in this program. And then myself and Peter will ask individual questions to each of the filmmakers. Yeah. We have general questions for all of the filmmakers at the end, but it'd be really great to get your questions. So please do send them through. So Michael, would you like to say who you are and why you made this film?
And a little bit about your practice in general is also really helpful, I think.
Yeah, no worries. Hi, I'm Michael Barwise. I'm the director of Legacy. My background is mostly short film work, but and I kind of work between documentary and fiction, and kind of experiment a lot with sort of hybrid approaches to that. For Legacy, it was made in response to a brief. It was for Random Acts, and the brief was coming up to 50 years of the Troubles, and they wanted to kind of commemorate that. So they'd arranged like a season of films, and then they also were commissioning some random acts. And I suppose we I had read about the Great Cat Massacre, which is what the film's kind of based on, a few years ago, and I kind of always wanted to do something about it. And it sort of came across with them when this brief came up, and I was just thinking, like, how do you respond to that, or how do you kind of like approach that? And I thought, well, actually, maybe do it in a different way. And I was looking at intergenerational trauma and kind of trauma passed down through generations. And then I went into looking, and that sort of led me on to like the collective unconscious, which led me into looking at gut and brain kind of communication and how sort of bacteria is passed on through time. And then the cat sort of aspect, I was playing with this idea of, in a way, I think we kind of have domesticated trauma, or trauma's become something that's just kind of like we just live with, which is sort of like a house cat or like a cat, and we kind of domesticated something and brought it into our lives, and we just live with it. So that's kind of how that relationship kind of came about. And then using the because then it's just I don't know if anybody is aware, like the story of the Great Cat Massacre is just, so it was like in France in I think I don't know, it was pre-French Revolution, and these printmakers just kind of went, they killed their master's cats, and then they just went on like this kind of rampage of murdering cats through like district in Paris. And I was kind of like always interested in that because, well, like I've always had cats, and my dad, he's a printmaker, so it's kind of like, oh, it's a nice, just nice. So it's always kind of been there. And then I just brought it in for this briefing, and that's kind of how I responded. So yeah.
Brian, thank you. Michael, Simon.
Hi everyone, I'm Simon Appley, and I'm very fortunate to have two films in the program. My background is in artist film and documentary, and I suppose I made Eden because I wanted to make a film about my hometown, but I definitely didn't want to look through the lens of the Troubles. I wanted to basically look at who lived across the road, who lived around the power station. And I'd actually been living in London, so I was going back and forwards to Eden quite a bit and collecting footage. But I was lucky with that particular project to get funded through Film London's Artist Film and Video Award to start off with. And so I made Eden over a sort of probably about a 3 to 4 month period where I was going back and forwards, shooting material, walking around the power station, collecting. And then I made the film, and I thought the film was finished, to be honest, and that was it. And then over the next 10 years, I think I've made 5 films about Eden altogether. It's the gift that keeps on giving. And I think that's what it is. I've always been interested. I think this comes out of the artist process, possibly, is it's all about process, and one film potentially leads to the next. So I had an exhibition in Derby as part of the Format Photography Festival, and they wanted to show the work, and I put 4 of the films together, and I felt like actually it just needed a final chapter. So I had over the years been collecting photographs when I'd go back to Eden and visit my mum. I've been collecting photographs of all the decayed houses, all the empty houses, and I basically had this sort of archive of photographs. So I felt like it just sort of felt apt to sort of finish the sort of Eden series with this film, which was about this landscape and the sort of stories that were left. And to be honest, I was the person who, and my mother as well, my mom and me, my sisters, whatever, are the people who remembered those stories. So I wanted to make a film that sort of wrapped up the series. But in saying that, I'm making another film, which is in the town beside Eden, Carrickfergus. So it's sort of, there's something interesting about that to discuss. So that's it.
Brilliant, thank you, Simon. Seamus.
Hello. Eden and White Abbey and Carrickfergus are fascinating places. Eden's really on paradise. I'm Seamus Harahan. I make, I guess, what you could call lateral documentary or something. Tessie's is a bit of a look behind the scenes of another part of the Troubles, which is what happens to people who don't kind of cohere to the imposed sort of agendas, is that they sort of become exiled in a soft sort of way, which involves a lot of drink, but it's also something that's just kind of, it's just always been there. It's not just an adaptation. And the thing that compelled me to film it was that, like a lot of people's local small histories are wrapped up around it, because it was whenever the pubs shut in the town, all the hardcore drinkers that's where they could come for a drink. They hated each other, but they had no choice. So like you would see going to school in the morning, you would see people leaving at 11 o'clock, which was opening time, just going back up to the pub. But there was a lot of very intelligent men who didn't agree with, in my case, a very strong Republican pressure. But the thing that compelled me to shoot the film was that I found out that it was going to get pulled down and they were going to build a proper bar and restaurant. They actually just put a proper garage roof on the shop beside it, which is now a proper spot. They built a hotel or a restaurant bar, and they spent about 3 years running it into the ground. So I don't know, I see it important as a bit of local kind of a snapshot of something that's gone, which might have some sort of universality in terms of Ireland, and is something that has something to do with post-conflict as well, that these spaces are not functioning. So yeah, it was a very spur of the moment Christmas trip home production, made with a DV tape and no planning. So
Well, all the best work is.
yeah. Well, I'd like to say as well, because Julia was saying about her film being short, but sometimes they're just 12 frames can be amazing, you know. So
Yeah, definitely. No, go ahead. That's a good introduction to Julia. Would you?
I'm Julia. Yeah, I'm a filmmaker. Yeah, I often work as like a shooter for people, like director of photography. And my main interest is in moving image, but then also my main interest, well, that's because I grew up in Northern Ireland, and I wasn't really exposed to any of the classics, but I had art teachers and stuff who introduced me to like Bill Viola and stuff like that, and then I just like opened up this big, you know, world where I hadn't watched like a David Lynch film or anything, but I was actually really able to talk about all this very niche stuff. So I think that's the stuff I'm interested in making, and I just made this film of my sister just because I could. Most things I've made have involved a lot more preparation, and but yeah, it's just fun to not be, it's such a overused statement sometimes, but you know, not to be precious about things, I guess, you know. And you not just make, you know, I wasn't making for the sake of it, I was making because I love my sister, and I just wanted to like capture that moment in time. And you know, I wouldn't really be enthused to make a film about someone and where they're living if I wasn't like thinking, oh my gosh, they're amazing, like wow. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Julia. And Alex?
Ko Bluesdeck te maunga, ko Dirk te awa, ko Atlantic te moana, noirani a hau. Ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko Carol Monteith tuku whaia, ko Bill Monteith tuku papa. Ko Tuatapu te moana, taku tamahini, ko Vaimoana te piha, taku tamahini. Kei te piha tuku kāinga a nainei, ko Alex Monteith tuku ingoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. So I'm just wanting to, before I say more, to acknowledge that I'm Zooming to the panel and to greet you all from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand, on the lands of Ngāti Whātua. And so I get the film that is here is actually got a full title, Chapter and Verse, 16mm film recorded on the Melmount Road, Strabane, County Tyrone, Northern Ireland. But what it is it's a VHS that's been made. Oh, it's quite complicated. I was shooting a film called Chapter and Verse, and it was over four years that I was kind of making observational documentary footage. And I suppose film-wise, I'm sort of interested in what a document traces. And I was responding to the conditions of having immigrated with family in the late 80s to Aotearoa. And then that experience of sort of coming back and, you know, cyclically to family every year or two around funerals and just around maintaining family connections. And you see and feel space and time and culture changing. So by the time I got to uni here at art school, I wanted to make a film that somehow responded to the way I was living, keeping coming back. So yeah, I was making this 4-year-long kind of film, and I was shooting lots of Castle Derg is where the family is from, and I was reared in a unionist tradition, being Monteith, but moving to New Zealand, that has resulted in a kind of way of looking at all of those inherited kind of identity aspects and kind of going through a process of unlearning and rethinking. I can only characterize it as, because in Aotearoa, we're part of a colonial settler project. And then that made me look at unionism in a really different way. And so that bigger film was accreting over time, Chapter and Verse, as I was coming back over these 4 years between 2001 and 2004. And I was very resistant to the main narratives that were to relating to things around trauma, the way journalists were working. And I wanted to work much slower and look at what was muted in the landscape around the rural experience in Castle Derg particularly. And just because it sort of sits in that little curve of the border. And so a lot of things were going on. But yeah, so I was responding to all sorts of things, just empty fields, talking to people and relatives with, you know, who were victims and are victims, but also resisting reframing people in that way and looking for something else for film to be doing. And as a consequence of that, I finally gave in to start filming some of the parades and some of the other more tense cultural exchanges and protests. And it was in the context of that in 2001 that I was filming in the Melmount Road when there was the tail end of a protest on the marches. And so the kids were starting to sort of riot there. And I made footage, just observational footage. I was coming back from Derry and the Apprentice Boys Parade there. And then the RUC arrived to break up that riot, and then they confiscated the footage. And I had been shooting 16mm film, so we were just talking about media before in the breakout room. So the bigger film I was making was being shot on 16mm, but the RUC decided the then RUC were going to confiscate that film can. And, you know, that was that moment where as an artist filmmaker, you realize the footage in its potential to be evidence, all the things you're opposed to philosophically, it's all coming down in that space at once. And I had resisted, you know, filming those kind of things. But yeah, so the RUC did confiscate that footage, but it was 16mm and they didn't know how to process it. And so I went through this process of them trying to figure out what labs to send it to. There's a bit of a story about how they took the cans, but eventually I worked through politicians to have that material kind of returned. And when I got it back, it came back copied over to a VHS tape. And what you see in your festival is the exact replication of what the RUC returned to me, which is all slowed down and runs backwards and forwards as they search for faces. And I had shot everything very sort of distantly and lots of waist down. I just had this, it was sort of in between myself, wanting to be there and not wanting to be there. It was like, so they, yeah, so it was extremely difficult. And it was that moment where when I got the tape back as well, it has copyright to the RUC on it. And so I didn't have sovereignty over that footage either. And so I worked through some local politicians to have, you know, the film returned. I had to discuss with the police and CID in Strabane about what the film was, and and had 2 visits with them. So it's what you're seeing really is the trace of a kind of an interaction that I pulled aside out of a bigger film where that material is edited quite differently. So that's what the footage that you have there is. And I think it's quite a difficult piece of footage, but nonetheless, it sort of engages the kinds of the real difficulties, representation difficulties, ownership, and, you know, what's involved in a film process and what is in our lives there.
It's amazing.
It is, yeah.
Oh, and I would like to add as well that while I was there filming for the bigger work, I was on the Irish surf team. So my relationship with oceans and seas and borders was sliding all over the place. So yeah, that's an additional context that's important to me as a person.
Wow, surf team. And speaking amazing languages at the start of your share. This is impressive. So yeah, we're going to ask, we've already got some questions in, which is great, and we're going to come to them once we just do a round of questions with everyone individually. So Simon, starting with you, I was just wondering, like, your films, do you go looking for something in particular, or do you go out and work with what you find? I was wondering, what is the role of intention in your work?
I start with landscape first, and then find the people, then find the stories. So the films, though they're 14 minutes long, they're usually made over a long period of time. So it involves, especially Eden, for example, that was a good couple of months of me walking around the perimeter of the power station, knocking on doors, and all those interactions are literally me finding the people there and then, right, as I encounter them. So what I'm doing is I'm not sort of going out with like a set of questions, or it's about me just finding these things, but also, you know, the real slog as well of just standing in a field filming a power station for a couple of hours. You know, I mean, it's that's part of it. And, you know, knocking on doors and nobody answering, or someone telling you, look, they don't want to be part of it. So there is a very slow process to the films.
And yeah, when I wanted to ask Julia, yeah, you were saying that well, it's your sister and your twin sister, and it is literally an apartment tour with her, but yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about what else you were thinking about in making it, and I guess the some of the thoughts that it threw up for you?
Julie, you're on mute.
Oh, yeah.
I guess of for me, my sister and other siblings, we all left Northern Ireland pretty young, and yeah, and also grew up in like Unionist East Belfast, and also in a family that definitely didn't talk about the past or whatever's gone on. And yeah, and our identity was more like, I felt kind of like an American, like I feel like that because all the churches in my area were ran by like American like evangelicals. It's definitely like the center of the Bible Belt in my area. And like I knew who Billy Graham was. I listened to American Christian rock. I didn't like it. I'm obviously cool. But but now it's like, oh, you know, you go to another place and you're the Irish person, and you know, you're not more than ever. But and you know, you realize how you know how different you are to the people around you, and how you do have an identity. And yeah, I guess I haven't really ever, you know, I went to university, but I've never looked at my past from an academic perspective at all. I've always just been like, it's not interesting, move on. I'm a Protestant, shut up, like, you know. But now but now I think it's like, you know, well, both of us, me and my sister particularly, we talk about it a lot, and you know, we're very proud, you know, we girls, you know. But just because we girl means so much, you know, like we're a woman, but you know, just like, yeah, just the motivation to try to connect and understand yourself is hard, because you're not doing it for the entertainment of other people, because you know that they're not particularly going to resonate. You're not like, oh yeah, we had a ceilidh with like a fiddle, like, you know what I mean? That was not my life. It was more like, you know, baked beans and like
Billy Graham, yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, well, yeah, it's interesting because like mid-Atlantic, I know that your sister isn't on the Atlantic side of the, you know, the United States, but I guess it's interesting because a lot of the time it will be used as a kind of slang or like slur for someone who's maybe been away on their holidays to New York and come back with an American accent. But I think it is really interesting, and I definitely recognize some of those things myself, or like that, like I couldn't read an English or a novelist from England because it was sort of like too close, but also almost painful in a way, because it was it seemed very far away in terms of how people spoke and expressed themselves.
Totally. And you're in this weird intermission where you're just like,
but I mean, you were very humbly say, you know, it's a small film, but it was actually, and some also some of the other films in this search program were really key to us, because especially actually when we saw your film, but because I was just very conscious that in a lot of the images produced about Northern Ireland, whether it's like news or Hollywood films or crime series, a lot of the time domestic spaces and interiors will be shown, you know, basically somewhere a crime happened. And I think I really love the apartment tour, in that it was really joyful, and, you know, as you were saying earlier, full of love for your sister, but then also really brought the more difficult things about our identities and our history and present into it. So yeah, thank you.
Peter, so I have a question here that was sent in by Brian Beatty for Seamus, and it actually touches on what I was going to ask Michael next as well. So I might just ask Seamus a question and then come to Michael afterwards. So Brian said, Seamus has mentioned to me in the past about being aware that there may be aspects of the Troubles that people may not or may have been involved with, but would rather not talk about. How difficult is it to get people to open up about this? And do you think there are aspects of the Troubles that haven't been dealt with in cinema that can't be represented?
It's huge.
That's a tough question.
It's a good one.
You don't have to.
One of the things I would first say about, I think it's. I mean, it's the whole process of peace, reconciliation, understanding. Yeah, I'm actually reading Seamus Harahan's autobiography at the minute, and he's talking about him being in Parliament with the Unionists, and they're all being treated like Irishmen, and they're all aware that they're being treated like Irishmen. So, I have a little problem with lost lives having been already. I can see that there's a problem with another edition of the book coming out, but that book is the most important kind of document that there's been produced about the Troubles.
Which book is that?
Lost Lives.
Oh, Lost Lives, of course. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Can you say a bit about it?
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit about it in case people don't know?
Well, it's basically a very factual, court-based, media-based recording of the details of all of the death that occurred because of sectarianism, and the Troubles generally. So some of the stories and the intertwining stories are completely mental. Rogue RUC men, rogue totally. Everything. And I just don't see how you can condense it into a film. You know, yeah, I don't know if like one of the things I thought to do with that book is to make at the sitting of every assembly meeting of the day or whatever the important kind of gathering is of the assembly is that they read out one of the deaths from that anniversary and just until they get through the entire book. They pay two people to basically clear it with the families if they want that to happen. I think there's a lot more. I think just given the political environment generally, there's a lot more. I'm feeling more pressure as an artist to kind of become an activist rather than the sort of like I think the gentle side of art is kind of getting swept away in some respects, and I think it's very problematic in Northern Ireland because I'll give you for an example that the Art and the Troubles exhibition that the museum had about 10 years ago. I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it, and I couldn't see how they could deal with it, but without sort of beige washing it, you know. So, like one of the images that stood out to me in the exhibition, I did a lecture in it. And they tried to get me to show Holy Land, and I said no, it's got nothing to do with the Troubles. So they won't buy it off me or anything. But I went up to the exhibition afterwards, and there was a photograph by Phil Collins of the Drumcree protest, and it was sort of like just a little image that size, and it had been stuck on the edge of a wall like a last edition, a late hang. And I was aware that the person that was standing beside him was Heather Allen, who had brought him there, and she's one of the greatest Troubles artists you could find. I mean, there's a number of people I think are so. She no longer makes art. She was standing beside him. They didn't have any of her work, and they hadn't engaged her at all in the thing. So I really think that we kind of have to ignore those structures now. The funding structures don't work for me anyway, certainly. But that's another issue. That the idea that's sort of whatever you say nothing. Those attitudes prevail. They become bureaucratic, I think, and I think the whole thing needs to be audited, dissected, looked at. I think personally, people can do that or are doing that. I think filmmakers can help them to do that. Like Greencastle's an interesting one for me because it's also now the centre of this huge incursion into the mineral rights, which essentially will fuck Ireland environmentally. And none of the political parties are engaged with it. In fact, they probably are engaged with it somewhere subterraneanly, you know, So I find it's a really difficult time to think about. It's difficult to do it, first of all, anyway, but it's difficult to think about how it has a value, or what its values should, how it can actually stop itself from getting swept aside as this sort of, I mean, if you didn't have experimental film and a bit of science, you wouldn't have had any, early cinema, so I just think it's a strange time. And Northern Ireland's just this, like can I say something about Brexit? I never realised this until recently, but Ted Heath relied on the unionist vote to get us into Europe, which caused untold damage, beginning with McGirr's Bar. And it's really ironic now that this entity that was created 100 years ago is sort of like still a seismic, still a thing, a huge geopolitical factor in, or chip or something like. Carson even said he never, he said he was sold a pup, the Irish were sold a pup, and here we are. We don't know where we are. So, yeah, I really can't answer that question. I think that the artists are always going to be like the ones that are traversing those territories, and it's great that like Glasgow's just, I mean, it's part of the diaspora, the traversing of like our cultures, and so yeah, if it gets out, if things get made and things get out, I always say that it's got to be a help. But what we do is there's a lot of questions.
Thank you, Seamus. Yeah, but that's why it reminded me of the question that I was going to ask Michael, which was about, just think that the film is such a unusual way to approach legacy. And I was wondering, like, why did you decide to address it in that way? I mean, you spoke about the cats and being interested in that, but I'm just wondering about, how the legacy in dairy played into that, I suppose.
In terms of using cats, or in terms of using the like bacteria and stuff?
I think both.
Yeah, and like in terms like to be honest, I was really kind of hesitant using the cats, like, because it's kind of like, and hopefully it doesn't come across that way, because it was like, oh shit, like if you use cats, then are you comparing like cats to people, which is kind of like not at all what I was doing. It was more just kind of like, as I was saying before, like the idea of like domestication. But and they kind of, I suppose that actually the cats sort of became more of a gateway then into that idea of like the collective unconscious, and then the gut. And I thought, and that was just, and that sort of became more interesting, because as soon as I kind of found, like, was reading about that, I was like, oh, this is actually like, because I suppose like being like growing up post conflict is kind of like, how do you respond to something that you've never really seen, like you never really experienced it firsthand, kind of, fortunately. And then but it's something that's kind of in the ether, or something that's there. It's more like an atmosphere or a feeling. So it's kind of like, oh, how do you respond to that? And then it's kind of in that way, which I suppose, because actually I was just thinking about this in terms of our stuff as well. It's that idea of like, not the stories you tell yourself, but like even me as a filmmaker and as like someone growing up post-conflict, kind of coming up with a reason, being like, oh, maybe it's this bacteria thing, as in like, maybe that's like, as in, yes, it's interesting, but maybe that's just something I'm telling myself to kind of help explain what, like, the feeling, or like that, like what's going on, like what goes on. I think I just lost my train of thought there, but so that the kind of, so once I heard about the bacterium thing, I thought, oh, that's actually, there's something in that, and there's something in this, like, that's passing down. I think it's the fact that it's kind of passed on through birth and stuff like that, and you kind of pick it up hereditary. was just this kind of unconscious thing that's kind of in you, and it's like your instinct isn't like I suppose that nature versus nurture sort of thing, isn't like, is this always been on me? Is this going to be passed on? Is this like, am I going to pass this on or whatever? Is it just something? And then like, how do you sort of change that or cultivate that? And I think, and actually I suppose actually no, because the cat massacre thing was, because reading that, like a lot of what was interesting in that story was how sort of the aftermath of it, and the printmakers and all the apprentices, they would recount the stories and tell them, and like they would just tell them again and again after, like in the workshop, as like entertainment. And they had this thing called cats and music, which is like they would just make like music using like print tools and stuff, and this kind of crazy sort of music, and they would just burst into these kind of rituals of like song and dance. And there was something in that, just in terms of going back to that storytelling thing again, in terms of like the stories that we keep telling, and that we sort of involve ourselves with, even sort of like it's a weird one in terms of like harmlessly, like even if you go to a bar and you start singing like rebel songs and like, but you can't have nothing, but it's just like you're sort of like just keeping that sort of myth or that story going, and that narrative going, without maybe not necessarily knowing what you're doing, but you're kind of part of it. So I think that's sort of what I was sort of, that sort of was like going on in my head at the time. It was made really quickly. I think it was like I think it was like 3 months or something actually. Like I made it like really fast. But at the time as well, which is kind of like, because thinking it's not like, I don't think it's that hopeful a film, whereas now in depth, like I feel, but at the time I think there was like, the reason, like I think the reason for that was like, I remember sort of the day, sort of like just when thinking about it and going to pitch, it was actually the night before was when Mayor McKee was murdered in Derry. So we just had this whole like, oh fuck, like just this, like it was just a serious like, what the hell is going on? So that was the sort of environment that was made. So then it was made like within 3 months of that. So it wasn't like, so that you were just sort of like just feeling like, what is like, this is so like, what is, it was just, it was a really kind of weird time in Derry, really strange time. And then so just had that atmosphere, whereas because now it's like, I definitely would say like the next thing I make is like probably going to be more hopeful than that, but which is why it's really nice in terms of like all the like the like our films and program are like, there's like really nice humor there, and there's like nice, like, so just like having that sort of range, whereas but there is like, I mean, there's a wee tinge of, like I say, that in terms of, is this just a story I'm telling myself? Is it, like, am I finding an explanation for something I can't explain? But which is, I think, was kind of what Simon was saying, is like part of the process, in terms of like, it's just part of the process of loving as well as making work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no. Sorry, someone saying something?
Oh, it was me again. I'm always interrupted. Yeah, well, I guess I wanted to ask Alex as well. Was in a way, well, the film that you're showing in this program, and I actually should also really point people to Circuit in New Zealand, the artists or the organisation that supports and advocates for artists moving image in New Zealand. That as far as last time I looked anyway, the full film chapter and verse is available for viewing there, and I really recommend it. It captures so much of the kind of really particular Northern Irish architecture. I don't know the right way to. There's probably a much better way to say that, but from the very sometimes gaudy golden eagles or kind of gateposts on farmhouses to streets in Belfast, and it's a really wonderful film, and very captures the landscape and the pain of that, and the poverty in a lot of ways too, in a way that I hadn't seen before at that time, I think, and haven't seen very many times since. But yeah, I mean, I think, but then with this small excerpt, I was, it is really like a structural film, I guess, or it's like but then it does reveal something of the structure, the one of the overarching structures of power in Northern Ireland. And I was intrigued. You were going to say something a little bit earlier about how the RUC took the cans, but maybe of film, but this sort of it's like a stranger than fiction encounter. But I was wondering what that then in a way revealed to you that you hadn't maybe understood before about the situation, maybe.
Yeah, I think I'll just I don't get many chances to talk to ones that really understand the situation of working there, so I'll just, full disclosure. Yeah, I mean, that was a scenario where my politics were very much about wanting to acknowledge quiet things that were unvisual about the pain and the conflict, and what the kind of deaths had translated. So there was sort of something very subtle that wasn't translating into landscape. A lot of artists were working with that, but I did make that decision then to flank what was going on in that chapter and verse film with some points of connecting with politicians who had large platforms like Edward Daly and Ian Paisley and the like. And that meant also tending then to some of those big other, parades and statements of identity. And also I attended Drum Cree as well at that time, which was the biggest British military installation, that had occurred to date. So I was in a way working a little bit against my own politics to be in that space, because I had resisted it. My practice is generally more poetic and more open-ended. But also that was also the texture of what was around and what was going on, and those rites are sort of rhythmical, and the parades, the sort of, it was like, what did it mean to not respond to it in some way too? You get caught in them, you get caught in the infrastructure of them. So but the RUC arrived at that. I didn't know they were going to come, but what happened was that one of the rioters just threw one of the bottles through the back windshield of the car, of a car, and many vehicles, but it happened to be a plainclothes police car, and then that sent the full might of the armored, the old armored vehicles, the Land Rovers, and they sort of just came in and circled everybody, but really they ended up circling me, because the fact is that, and as they, kind of reiterated at the time, any camera in those situations is throwing petrol on the event to a degree, even though I had actually stayed, right out of the way. That was all happening. So I arrived into that scenario. But then there is a lot of truth to that. It doesn't help having a camera there. The kids perform, they are aware of it, or they were in those times. And so I had all those navigations and conversations. I was hauled into the police station and all of that. But when they confiscated the footage, I was very fearful, about that scenario. There was a lot of people around, and I live in the community, or I was then. And so that was very complex for me. And so I asked if I could hand that footage over further away from where everybody was. And so we went down to one of those side lanes. And when they were there, they saw there were heaps of 16mm. That's just my interest to filmmakers here in this group, but that I had heaps of 16mm film cans in there, like daylight loads. And, that's out of time. That was a digital generation, but I wanted to shoot on film and work slowly and work that way. And they were convinced that that was all of people that were making bombs or doing goodness knows what. And I was like, no, it's landscape footage. It's other events. It's days and days of other works. I had all these conversations just even to try and retain my own archive. So they did take just the one can out of the camera, but then it was like that situation of going, the camera will expose all the film if it was so complex, the whole situation. But I got to keep my camera. But they took that daylight load can, and then sort of went on from there, and then they didn't know how to process it, and then they were back in touch about that. And then it was all so difficult, because I didn't want any of that to go into the space of evidence. That wasn't, it was an art film. I was doing research, that kind of thing. But the fact is, over there, and we're at home, film doesn't always have that status, that you don't have the luxury of abstraction when you are in that kind of conflict state, and the special powers that police have, those kind of things. It's a different workspace. And I felt that maybe after 10 years had passed, I authored that artwork 4 years after I'd made the main piece of work, when I was really thinking about the status of a film document and different kind of traces. So that's how it came about. So it's mainly shown as video installation, and it hasn't been shown a lot. It's a very distant reality here in Aotearoa, the specifics of the North. But so I think it's a real privilege to be able to meet you all. And Seamus, what you were saying about lost lives, it actually meant a lot to me that had been published at the time as well, because it just peers down. It's like a skeleton that helps you away from the kind of difficulties that sit in the narrative space, and you can just contemplate and reflect on what's occurred. And so I drew on it too for chapter and verse in a certain way as well. So there's a chapter of it that sort of thinks about the way that lost lives kind of acknowledges people within. Yeah, so it's a very important piece of work.
Thank you, Alex. So we have 8 minutes left, and we have some other questions. So we have one for Seamus, and if we can keep the answer brief, and then we've got a couple for Simon. So I'm going to try and get through them, and then any that I don't get through, Simon is also doing a talk on Friday at 11:30 about his work and his process. So I will take those questions to that if I don't get through all of them, and everybody is welcome to come to that as well. It'd be great. So Seamus, this question is from Lucy, and she said, I was really struck by the movement in the camera work and the position that this created within an already intimate scene. I was wondering how you think about the position of the camera and within that scene, and how much the camera's movement is subjective within the space of the film.
It's a good question. I sort of I've always eschewed tripod. For me, the camera, what you want your camera to do is to approximate what your brain and your eye do. So I would never use slow zooms. I mean, your eye and your mind can kind of zoom in a sort of way. So I think after that, it's understanding your equipment and having a skill where you can actually just somehow translate to get to the point where you kind of know what your frame is, and you don't have to look through the viewfinder unless you're changing something. That in a way they're just learned skills from just knowing your. And after that, it's a very unchoreographed sort of response. So in a way, essentially, I'm just trying to use the camera as an approximation for that immediate peripheral experience of vision and perception. So your eye is kind of like your camera is attached to a moving thing, which is your body, yeah, in a way, I just think that the peripherals part a really strong part of how you experience your physical space and how you perceive yourself. And the stuff about subconscious and it's all very interesting because I've only just started kind of reading Carl Jung, where he's talking about personality types being intuitive, and it goes back to this sort of thing of your gut and your head, that be these sort of resonance and dissonance between the two things that are also the sort of a an analogy of how you're trying to resolve yourself with the world, you know. So it's, yeah, I don't know. It's something that technique is something that I prefer not to have to think about, you know. Making art something that I definitely try not to think about, you know, because then it's like, am I making art? You know, I think all of the kind of things that can get teased out are prior to having any of those sort of intellectualized thoughts. So it just in terms of the way that I'm sort of working, which is very automatic, bearing witness, or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, it's just about perception, and then how do you translate that? And you're using a camera in this case, you know. So.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that link. It's really good. And Lucy actually has another really good question for Simon, again focused on the formal aspect. She says, the shots of the notebooks in ancestral houses were really interesting. The book struck me as containers for histories, and I wonder, what do you think about the idea of a short film as a container for partial histories and stories? Oh, you're on mute.
So I'm very conscious of time, actually. I can answer that question in detail on Friday, if you come along on Friday, to plug my own thing. But yeah, that's what the notebooks are there for. They're a sort of a document of my own personal history and things that I have reflect on and find. But I am very conscious of the time. So come along on Friday, and maybe you should use the last 3 minutes to ask Michael or Julia a question.
Hand it over to you, Peter, if you have one in particular, because I've got like another one for you, Simon. I think people just need to come to your talk on Friday.
Just come to the talk on Friday, and then at least there'll be somebody there. And you know, I think, you know, yeah, do that.
Yeah. Well, we had a huge question that we wanted to ask everybody, but I mean, apparently we can go a couple of minutes over though, 5 minutes to be exact, or we could stop now and thank everybody. So this is the great question. This is the great question.
Maybe we could ask off air.
We could ask what?
We could ask off air.
Ask off air, yeah. No, because I think the question we have for everybody is probably gonna take a lot of time. But I think what's really seems to have come up, I suppose, if I was rounding this up, what's really come up through this whole discussion has been essentially, or what for me, what I found really interesting was how everyone talked about this atmosphere and trying to, and somehow being quite subjective in their work and coming at it at the side angle. And that's what we really loved about all of the work. And also there's so many links between the works that I think have come up in the conversation, like about these sort of forgotten places that both Simon and Seamus were talking about. So yeah, I think that we might just end it there, and then and just thank everyone for the work, and again remind them, if they want to see the short films, that they're on the hub for another 24 hours, and then Simon's talk is on Friday. So that's it.
Yeah, thanks so much everybody for joining us and watching, and yeah, hope you enjoy the rest of the festival too. It's been a real pleasure speaking with everyone.
And there's also a podcast as well. Might flag that up for the features. There was a podcast, episode 11, on the Glasgow Short Film Festival, where Mariah, Garnet and Margot Harkin and Des Bell talk about the features that are also part of this programme. So really recommend that. And thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.